Okay, I think I have it under control now. So the most important things to do is, in my opinion, to recognize the problem, to raise awareness of problems, to stop perverse incentives, to adapt outdated legislations and regulations, to remove unfair competition, to raise awareness of alternatives, to invest in rewetted land use, to support research and development, and to use peatlands as synergy hotspots. Let us look at these points. We have heard, and we should recognize, that the use of drained peatlands leads to severe greenhouse gas emissions, to subsidence and land loss, in many areas progressively fast, in other areas to soil degradation and land loss, specifically in more continental areas. It leads to severe erosion, specifically in mountainous areas. It leads to water pollution as a result of the mobilization of nitrates and the availability of dissolved organic carbon. And all in all, we can conclude that peatland drainage and use may on the short term leads to gains, important gains that makes it attractive, but on the long term it is negative for society and economy. The peatland problems that we face are caused by land use, mainly by agriculture. Probably 50% or more of all problems are caused by agriculture on drained peatland, overgrazing of drained peatlands, specifically in mountainous areas, forestry on drained peatlands, specifically in the boreal zone, and what should not be forgotten, that these problems with drained peatlands, they continue with abandonment. We see that a lot of areas are abandoned because they cannot use anymore, but the negative environmental effects continue unless these areas are rewetted. We notice that there are a lot of incentive subsidies that actually increase the problems. We see that agricultural subsidies stimulate the drainage of peatlands and the use of drained peatlands. The European Union direct payments and the cross-compliance simply stimulates the use of drained peatlands. We see that the demand for biofuel has worldwide increased the drainage of peatlands. It was so with palm oil, it is still so in Europe with maize, it is in the United States with sugarcane. We cultivate biomass on drained peatlands. We use this biomass to making biofuels that we use to reduce our emissions, but we forget to calculate the emissions of carbon dioxide from the drained peatland soils. It is a major driver of this problem. The costs of draining peatlands and maintaining them in a drained conditions are generally taken by society. The subsidies on land improvement, on land consolidation, but also subsidies on pumping costs and dike maintenance actually stimulate the fact that drained peatlands are still used, are still competitive. A nice example that I read recently was in the Netherlands. They use windmills to drain the peatlands and to keep them drained. So they use wind energy to stimulate greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, we have to rewet these peatlands. That is the most simple solution. But we see in practice that this change to wet or rewetted peatland use is frustrated, for example, by the failing recognition of wet crops as agricultural crops. If you change the cultivation of maize on drained peatland to the cultivation of reed on rewetted peatland on the same peatland, a farmer in Europe loses his subsidies because wet crops are not recognized to be agricultural crops. It's a matter of regulation. We see that the change to a wise wet land use is obstructed, for example, by a ban on converting grassland on peatland. The ban on grassland plowing was introduced to reduce emissions and to increase biodiversity. If you want to rewet the area, you have to convert the grassland and you have to compensate for this drained peatland use by draining some other peatland. So it's a perverse rule. We experience that if we change a maize field on drained peatland into a wet reed field, that automatically nature conservation legislation leads to the fact that these are then protected habitats that obstruct the normal land use and land use change. This actually, all these things that I have mentioned, they lead to unfair competition. In many parts of the world, agriculture is severely subsidized, is severely benefiting from existing rules. These same boundary conditions do not exist for the wise use of peatlands. So if we want to remove this unfair competition and give the wet use of peatlands a chance, we have to stop with these perverse incentives. We have to impose taxes on drained peatland use. Here in Germany, an arable field on peat produces a damage of 2,500 euros per hectare per year to the environment. And society has to pay for that. And we have to impose taxes to this environmentally damaging peatland use. And of course, we have to change counterproductive legislation. With the wet, responsible use of peatlands, we are in many parts of the world fighting against the belief that was started with the start of agriculture in the Middle East, in a semi-desert, that agriculture has to be dry, that agriculture has to be taking place on plowed land. We have to change this mentality and raise the awareness that wet is good, that wet is possible, and that wet is necessary. And in the same way as we have invested in the last decades, in the last century, in the large-scale drainage of peatland and the adaptation of peatland use to dry conditions, we have to turn the clock around. We must invest in the rewetting of peatlands and in rewetted land use. We must make investment grants available for land reallotment and hydrological restructuring, because most of the projects must be of a large scale. You cannot rewet one single hectare. We have to develop adapted machinery that works on wet lands, and we must stimulate farmers to acquire these machineries. We have to develop production lines for these new products. And of course, we have to consult, we have to guide farmers to use peatlands in a wet way where they have learned always and everywhere to drain peatlands. And of course, research is also necessary. Specifically, research and development of adapted machinery, adapted logistics. We should not underestimate how difficult it is to harvest from wet areas where you cannot drive 10 or 20 times over the same land. This is a logistic challenge that we have to face and that we have to investigate. We have to develop alternative wet crops, like Susa Abel has reported on, and we have to develop alternative products, both for these alternative crops, but also to replace the products that now come from drained peatland use. We have big chances dealing with peatlands because drained peatland use leads to a wide variety of problems, environmental problems. So if we rewet peatlands and use them in a wet way, in a wet sense, we can create synergies, and we should therefore develop synergetic hotspot strategies for peatland rewetting and polycultures. We can then address climate change mitigation by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We can address climate change adaptation by stopping subsidence and land loss, reducing peak flow, what will increase with changing climate, improving water availability for the dry periods that we are going to face, to reinstate evapotranspiration cooling that on a regional scale can cool the climate when the global climate is warming. We can improve food, fodder, fiber and fuel security by reducing land loss and specifically also by restoring degraded land. Millions of hectares of degraded peatlands are now laying idle around. We have to restore these degraded lands for productivity, for improving food security and other securities. And as a lot of wetland species and habitat have become rare in many parts of the world, rewetting, restoring wetlands, peatlands also leads to the conservation of biodiversity, and last but not least, to reducing emissions of nitrates and dissolved organic carbon, and therewith to pollution control. The message is clear. That's where we have to work on in policy, and everywhere peatlands must be wet. Thank you.